A diver's light cuts through green water like a blade through silk. The beam falls on stone, carved, worn, impossible, as if some drowned architect had laid a city along the sea's ribcage. Salt blooms from every crevice, silt breaths slowly, the way a sleeping animal breathes. Below the keel of a small research vessel the seafloor sits like a removed ceiling. Tessellated paving stones, the stump of a column, the lip of a carved doorway half buried in algae. Above, gulls wheel and the engine hums. Below, centuries rearrange themselves in the patient tides. The scene feels both intimate and cosmic, a domestic ruin made into a planetary relic. No one knows who first pushed these stones beneath the water. No one knows the exact hour the city drowned. The enigma deepens with each trawl of the sonar screen. Imagine standing at the lip of one of these submerged thresholds, wetsuit and regulator hissing, the surface a distant mirror. What would you believe if you felt the weight of those stones pressing against your palms? The first accounts came from fishermen. Small boats, nets snagged on something hard where charts showed only mud, copper coins tangled like scale on the line. Local tales traded over tea of lamps that burned under waves. Recorded in local accounts, mid-20th century, those stories were the first breadcrumbs leading explorers into the dark. An early expedition, not glamorous, often cold and bureaucratic, took sonar pings and old sailors' whispers and sent cameras down. Grainy footage recorded columns lying like broken teeth, statues with faces obscured by incrustation, and inscriptions half-eaten by time. Survey footage, archival, scientists looked at those images and felt the pull every scholar feels, the sudden, urgent promise of a story waiting to be read. Sunken temples are paradoxes. They are both the most intimate kind of ruin and the most foreign. A temple is a place of rituals, of altars and touchable surfaces. Water steals touch. It robs you of sound and replaces it with a foreign language of pressure and drag. Yet water can also be a preserver. Organic offerings, garments, wooden beams, items that would rot dry on land, sometimes survive, wrapped in anoxic mud. The sea is both thief and archivist. How did these temples come to be underwater? There are two broad families of answers: catastrophic events that pulverized the coastline, and slow, patient subsidence where land sank beneath the patient weight of time and tide. Each explanation changes the story of the people who built them. In one small bay, a ring of columns rises like the spine of some beached leviathan. Divers crawling across those columns find chisel marks still visible, tiny geometric motifs that imply a stable tradition of craft. Detailed photogrammetry, recent, the presence of such marks argues that these were not hastily abandoned sites. Something more complex than a sudden flight must have taken place. Yet in another site, whole roofs lie intact, collapsed inward like the closed hand of the sea. Ceramics lay strewn in places where they could not have simply been swept away. There, the evidence whispers of a single violent night, earthquake, wave, and rapid inundation. Geophysical survey, sediment cores, archaeology below water follows rules similar to its terrestrial cousin, but the methods feel adapted to a different planet. Laser scanning, photogrammetry, and side-scan sonar build virtual copies of ruins so precise a conservator could measure erosion in millimeters. Radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence can date sediments and ceramics. Dendrochronology, when wood survives, gives us a year or near year. Yet each method has its limits when salt and pressure and time conspire to obscure the signal. Some suggest the temples belong to a lost cult whose rituals were sung to the sea. Others propose they were civic structures, temples in name but public markets in life. The mainstream view favors multifunctional use, sanctuaries that hosted ritual, trade, and administration. But that leaves unanswered the question of why these particular buildings sank while others on the same coastline remained. Is this a local anomaly, or part of a pattern the map does not yet reveal? When you watch a diver's footage for long enough, you begin to see patterns, certain motifs, repeated symbols, architectural frequencies like a composer repeating a phrase across movements. Circles. Spirals. A certain kind of raised lip that frames basin-like depressions. The motif becomes a cipher, a sigil waiting for an alphabet to match it. Field notes often include a silent line. Local informant, the stones sing at night. Folklore breathes around these ruins. Stories of lovers turned to coral, of priests who walked into the sea and never returned. Folklore is not evidence, but it is an interpretive chord. It tells us how living communities remember, or reinvent, their past. What do the inscriptions say? In many cases, they are barely legible. Incrustation forms a crust like calcified lace. Letters become seashells. But where inscriptions survive, they offer hints, names that repeat, references to periods of construction, lists of dedications. Transliteration sometimes yields recognizable words shared across neighboring cultures, suggesting trade, shared liturgies, or overlapping artistic networks. At one temple, a frieze depicts boats with double-striped hulls and roped figurines standing in them, an emblem repeated on ceramics found in distant ports. That emblem becomes a tracer line across the sea: traders, pilgrims, conquerors. It hints at a coastline network more dynamic than the static map suggests. Comparative iconography: archaeologists probe the question of production and transport with a craftsman's eye. How were columns quarried, shaped, and moved? Quarry marks give us the answer for some sites: a consistent approach to block extraction, the use of levers and sledges on damp sand, the community labor required to move heavy stones. It is easy to imagine a bustling harbor where masons and sailors and priests interlaced their days like ropes crossing a mast. But imagine now a night when the earth hummed. Sediment cores record abrupt changes in grain size, shells are jostled out of life position, diatoms show a sudden turnover. Geophysicists read these as signs of tsunami or liquefaction. If the ground itself liquefied beneath the temple's foundation, whole structures might have slid seaward as if the earth had been greased by catastrophe. Sediment core analysis, geophysical report: if such an event occurred, were there survivors? Did they carry the cult's memory inland? We find echoes in place names and shifting ritual centers. Temples may drown, but gods are resilient when people continue to believe. Another mystery lies in the objects, bowls too finely made for quotidian use, figurines depicting hybrid beings, human torso, fish tail, that recur in distant sites. Such hybrids suggest a shared mythology that binds disparate ports, a maritime pantheon perhaps, deities who live between water and stone. Are these hybrid figures religious icons, merchant guild badges, or talismans for sailors? Each hypothesis shapes our imagination of the society. Speculative theories sometimes bloom in the spaces left by incomplete evidence. The suggestion that the temples were naval shipyards, or that they mark submerged ritual boundaries that controlled seasonal migrations of fish. These ideas are valuable as thought experiments, but must be labeled speculative until harder evidence appears. Modern research often arrives as a technical parade: autonomous submersibles mapping corridors, multispectral imaging revealing pigments hidden beneath incrustation, residue analysis hinting at oils and incense. One recent campaign used microexcavation under controlled conditions to recover wooden beams preserved in anaerobic mud. Tree ring analysis dated one beam to a narrow decade, anchoring the site's construction to a defined period. Dendrochronology, recent, ethics shadow every underwater dig. The ocean's ruins are tempting targets for looters because artifacts fetch high prices and enforcement is harder at sea. Conservationists argue for in situ preservation whenever possible. Leave the stones in the sea if removal damages context. Laws vary, but international instruments like UNESCO conventions provide frameworks, albeit imperfect ones. UNESCO convention references: at dusk, communities living near these ruins gather stories. An old woman points to a reef and uses a word whose consonants tumble in a way that resists English. She says it means broken promise. Local term: Zauru, pronounced Shauru. Translation: broken promise. She remembers her grandfather's stories of lamplight processions that walked the shoreline, of offerings cast into water to keep the spirits at bay. Folklore shapes a different archaeology, one of memory, grief, and reclamation rather than excavation. What is missing from our understanding are small, stubborn things: the names of craft masters, the specific rituals enacted within the sacrificial basins, the sequence of repairs those temples underwent between their inauguration and their submergence. We list these absences like inventory: 1. builder names and patronage records. 2. Precise chronology of inundation. 3. Material use and perishable decorations. These gaps are not failures but invitations. Sometimes the sea returns what it can. A bronze buckle appears, corroded but still engraved with a pattern. Conservators stabilize it and reveal, under layers of oxidation, an icon, a circle pierced by 3 rays. The symbol starts to appear elsewhere in the corpus. A reader in a distant university suggests this might be a calendar sign or a guild mark. Another suggests a ritual code. Debate follows. Publication ensues. The enigma deepens. If you stood on the deck and ran your hand along a recovered block, you could feel the tool marks, the thumb of the stonemason centuries ago. That physical connection is what drives field archaeologists, the humbling intimacy of touch across ages. It is also what complicates conservation. Once a stone is lifted, its environment changes forever. Conservators weigh the desire to study against the duty to preserve. In the lab, conservators use desalination baths measured in weeks and months, slowly leaching salt from pores. Microbial communities that once lived on the stone change in the dry air. Pigments, once held by the salt matrix, can flake. The act of saving can be an act of altering. There are moments in underwater archaeology when technology reveals what the naked eye can't. Multispectral imaging picking up traces of ochre beneath calcification. CT scanning revealing an inner cavity where ritual objects were once hidden. Each technical breakthrough is simultaneously a gift and a provocation, a code that demands interpretation. What of the people who use these temples? Potsherds tell us diets, fish species, imported grains. Bones show healed trauma, a community that fought, healed, and ate. Dental isotopes reveal mobility. Some individuals grew up inland, others near distant coasts. A city is never single-boned, it is a braided rope of life histories. Religious life, as glimpsed through ritual deposits, suggests that offerings were varied, perfumed oils, imported glass beads, carved ivories. A child's toy, a miniature boat, suggests that the sea was not merely feared but loved, integrated into childhood fantasies. The presence of toys complicates grim narratives of sacrifice. It suggests a world where water was also playground and provider. But there are darker traces. Human remains in positions that suggest hurried burial or violent collapse. A skeleton found with a coin in a clenched fist, another curled as if shielding the face. Osteologists note perimortem trauma inconsistent with routine death. Violence, whether from war or disaster, played a role in some losses. Which of these narratives is the right one? Perhaps all, in parts. Cultures are rarely singular in meaning. Temples host markets and prayers, births and lawsuits. The watery grave of a temple may have been an earthquake's consequence, an economic shift symptom, and the visible hinge on a long story about trade networks and climate. Climate adds another layer. Sea level rise is not only modern, the coastline is dynamic. Over centuries, shoreline changes can be substantial. Palynological studies, pollen trapped in sediment, shows shifts in agriculture. A decline in certain crops may coincide with reduced maintenance of coastal defenses, making a temple more vulnerable to a tidal event. Pollen analysis, sediment cores. Once, at the edge of a submerged colonnade, divers found a small inscribed tab, a votive plaque, placed where waves could reach but not take it entirely. Its inscription read in a terse formulaic script, a plea to a sea deity for safe passage. The handwriting suggests a hurried hand, someone likely not a priest. These personal artifacts force us to imagine individuals. Merchants anxious about a crossing, a mother asking mercy for a child. Human emotion is the surest anchor amid archaeological uncertainty. What do the motifs, circles, pierced discs, fishmen, mean in the day-to-day lives of their makers? We can construct philological links between similar motifs in distant sites, but meaning is slippery. Our best recourse is comparative ethnography and careful, patient cross-examination of material evidence. Each symbol is a small argument, each fragment a clause. There are, inevitably, competing voices outside the academy, treasure hunters who see only value, religious revivals claiming ancestral rights, popular writers spinning myth into certainty. These voices complicate both conservation and public understanding. Responsible narration means making clear the difference between evidence and claim, the measured probability of a reading versus a wish. The sea preserves stories in a particular grammar. It erases edges, it blends sequences. Archaeologists must become translators attuned to gaps. They read negative space as intently as carved stone. A missing wall can be as telling as a preserved one. A hole in the sediment record might map to a short-lived event or to later human activity that removed context. Sometimes technology reveals anachronisms, a style inconsistent with its supposed period, a ceramic wheel thrown when the culture had usually hand-built ware. Such anomalies force historians to reevaluate typologies and timelines. Perhaps a community imported a craftsman, or perhaps our periodization is wrong. Consider the discovery of a submerged amphora with traces of resin and a stamp that matches a coastal polity known from distant texts. The stamp links the site to broader trade routes. Trade, long the route of cultural exchange, explains much: shared iconography, borrowed architectural motifs, mixtures of deity names. Ports are where identities mingle. Temples on coasts were as much civic as sacred. At night, when the research vessel turns off its work lights, the sea becomes a mirror of stars. Crew tell stories of lights under the water that seem too regular to be natural, lines of bioluminescence that flare like signal fires. Science offers explanations: organisms, currents, chemical gradients. Folklore offers other ones: watchmen of the drowned, lanterns of the lost. Both accounts coexist, and neither entirely answers the other. How do we tell this story to viewers, to you, watching at home? The temptation is to dramatize, to tie neat endings to complex processes. But the dignity of archaeology is in its patience. We can present the questions clearly: the who, the when, the how. We can show the evidence: map stone, radiocarbon dates, microstratigraphic sequences. And we must let the mystery breathe. If you listen closely to a diver's radio, if you slow the footage and watch the silt ices over a hand, you can sense a continuity between human intention and the indifferent sea. The ruins are not relics frozen in a museum. They are parts of a living coastline, subject to storms, tides, and human memory. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not simply the origin of these temples, but their meaning to the people who named them and the present communities who live above them. What do we owe to a submerged past? How do we balance research, conservation, and respect for living cultures? These are ethical questions as much as historical ones. Before dawn, a team gathers samples from a sheltered basin. Gloves, syringes, labeled vials. The sequence of procedures is ritualized, careful. Each sample is a promise to the future, a promise that the data will be preserved, that interpretations will be tested, that the voices of the living will be considered. Science here is deliberate and humble. Yet wonder remains. A carved face peers from a silted arch, a smile half vanished but still defiant. The smile is an argument against finality. It suggests continuity. The maker's hand once shaped it, and that shaping echoes into the present. Where will the next breakthrough come from? Perhaps in the next autonomous survey that maps not only the stones but microhabitats. Perhaps in an old archive where a traveler's log mentions a festival celebrating the submergence night. Maybe a local family will open an attic trunk to reveal a sketchbook. An amateur drawing could match a frieze and provide a name. The past reveals itself in layers: scientific, anecdotal, folkloric, stacked like sediment. Which theory fits best? Type yes if you think these temples sank in a single cataclysmic event. Type no if you believe a slower process of subsidence and neglect was at work. Which aspect intrigues you most, the architecture, the ritual life, or the human stories? We are, in the end, caretakers of curiosity. Each stone raised, each sample dated, each story recorded is an act of listening. The sea gives us fragments, and we build from those fragments a provisional narrative, a temple built by hands we will never know, drowning that was perhaps cruel and perhaps slow, a people who mourned and adapted. No single chapter can close the question. The ruins demand a long conversation across fields, with engineers, conservators, linguists, and local communities. Only then can the enigma ease from riddle toward understanding, itself a form of reverence. The ship's engines drop to a low, thoughtful hum as the crew prepares the next dive. A pale dawn slides across the water and the surface takes on the color of old pewter. Below, the mapped outlines of streets look like the veins of a hand frozen mid-gesture. On the morning the team first found the doorway, the sea was almost undecided, a glassy hesitation between calm and storm. A remotely operated vehicle, ROV, ran a cautious grid, its camera breathing like a lantern in the deep. Then, in a corner where sonar had shown nothing but smudge, the ROV's light found an arch, a keystone still intact, algae braided into the mortar. Sidescan sonar survey mission log, the doorway's lintel was carved with concentric circles, a motif the field notebooks had already named. The ring-sigil. The ring-sigil appears again and again across the submerged coast, stamped on amphorae handles, chipped into column bases, painted in faded ochre on a roof slab. It was as if the builders left a fingerprint, a circle within circles, wherever they wanted to mark sanctity. What did that symbol mean to them? A calendar? A god's eye? A pledge of maritime safety? The answer remained just out of reach. Divers descended in pairs, tethered to the ship like tethered thoughts. They moved slowly, letting the current choose the tempo. The water's cold compressed the senses. Sound turned to pressure and bodies felt large and solitary. When they reached the arch, their helmet lights revealed tool marks in a pattern so precise it suggested the same workshop had supplied blocks across the bay. Tool mark analysis, photogrammetry. Working underwater is like working on a piano inside another room. Small motions are amplified, and every error echoes. A single wrong lift can shatter the context that gives an artifact its meaning. So the team did what careful archaeologists do. They photographed, they mapped, and they waited for the controlled lift. They recorded the sequence in a voice log that would later sound like scripture to conservators. Coordinates, orientation, depth, sediment color, biological growth. Inside the doorway, the seafloor sloped toward a basin. The basin had once been a place of gathering, a shallow pool, an altar stone, a ring of low benches. Now, centuries of silt had laid a grave over its face. The divers probed with gloved fingers and came up empty-handed but with a faint pattern of abrasive wear on the altar's lip, the mark of repeated rituals. Someone had touched that stone 1,000 times. Someone had placed offerings there until the sea took the shore. Slowly, through patient micro-excavation, small things revealed themselves, a bead of colored glass the size of a thumbnail, a splinter of wood turned jet by time, an arranged cluster of tiny shells. One diver found an inscribed lead token, its letters obscured by life. In the lab, after months of desalination, the inscription resolved, a name and a dedication. The name matched inscriptions found inland in an administrative archive, a surprising link that anchored the site to a polity once thought distant. Inscription analysis, archival correlation, the discovery changed the map. It suggested that the city beneath the waves was not an isolated temple town but part of a political network stretching inland, connected by trade routes and the movement of people. It implied that the decisions to build, maintain, and perhaps abandon these structures were not merely local phenomena but tied to regional shifts in power and economy. Ritual deposits at the site surprised the team. Along with perfume residues and imported beads were mundane, intimate items. A child's bone whistle, a half-burned basket, a fragment of a garment woven with a distinctive twill pattern. Those personal traces suggested the temple was not an esoteric place reserved for an elite few but a community locus where domestic life and ritual life braided together. Priests prayed, yes, but mothers set down toys, and sailors left small amulets at the altar before long journeys. The sea, however, has its own logic. A storm recorded in sediment cores had left a distinct layer of sand and broken shell. Above that layer, the ceramic typology shifted, a certain luxury where disappears. Below it, the pottery assemblage was rich and varied. The sediment told a story of sudden disruption, a storm surge so severe it rearranged the occupational horizon, sweeping away some wares and burying others. Sediment core stratigraphy. But the coastal plain itself had been changing for centuries. Pollen trapped in layers beneath and above the temple showed a transition from cereal cultivation to salt-tolerant grasses. The change correlated with a reduction in maintenance of the coastal infrastructure. Seawalls that had once been recorded in tax lists were neglected. The picture that emerged was complex. Environmental stress, economic shifts, and episodic violence all combined to alter the human relationship with the shore. Palynology, economic records. In one of the most cinematic moments of the excavation, the ROV found a sealed chamber lying beyond a collapsed portico. The entrance had been scoured by currents and hidden beneath a carpet of bryozoans. Inside, the ROV's light found a table of stones laid in a pattern that corresponded to the ring-sigil. For an instant, the live feed made the ship's quiet deck feel like a cathedral. The team gathered in a huddle of radios and warm jackets, eyes reflecting the glow of the screen. When conservators managed a controlled recovery of the chamber's central object, they found a shallow bowl coated in a black residue. The bowl's interior contained traces of a resin mixed with pollen and microscopic charcoal. Chemical analysis later suggested a fragrant compound, perhaps an offering burned in ritual. The mixture included plant species traceable to distant hills, suggesting the temple's rituals reached inland, incorporating materials from multiple ecological zones. Residue analysis, biomolecular studies, the presence of inland botanicals in a coastal temple hinted at pilgrimage and gift exchange. People carried more than goods, they carried ritual meaning. A trader might bring a bag of grain and a sprig of thyme as if commerce and prayer were two sides of the same coin. These gestures complicate dry models that separate economy from piety. But not all anomalies delighted the team. A series of deliberate cuts in column bases suggested an attempt to dismantle the site in antiquity. The cut marks were too clean for erosion. They had been made with tools, perhaps to harvest building materials. Who cut the columns? Conquerors repurposing stone? Locals reclaiming materials during lean times? Looters stripping what they could? Each possibility carried different moral hues. Looting, in particular, is a modern scar. The team found patches where the seabed had been disturbed by metal detectors and improvised grabs. Once, a mesh bag recovered from a clandestine net contained fragments of pottery sold in markets overseas. International law provides frameworks, but enforcement at sea is challenging. The team worked with local authorities to mark protected zones and to engage fishermen as stewards, an approach that sometimes succeeded, sometimes did not. Community engagement became a fragile, necessary choreography. The team held meetings in a nearby village, slideshows, translated handouts, and long coffee-fueled conversations. Elders recited seasonal calendars that unexpectedly matched the ring-sigil's apparent lunar phases. Fishermen offered old maps annotated in ink that suggested an oral tradition of place names. These collaborations were not transactional, they changed the research questions themselves. A local's memory of a festival called the Night of Stones directed the team's attention to a submerged jetty that might otherwise have been overlooked. Every archive has its own smell, the dust, the glue, the memory. In a provincial archive, an 18th-century maritime clerk had doodled a coastline in the margin of a trade ledger. The coastline's curve, when overlaid with modern bathymetry, matched the submerged city's outline with eerie precision. A previously ignored note. The merchant's pier sank after the big storm, leapt from the page with new relevance. Old paper can sometimes be a sonar of another kind. Scientific debate is a conversation held in different voices. Geologists argued for tectonic subsidence in one bay. Modelers suggested a combination of gradual sea level rise and episodic storm surge. Anthropologists emphasized social choices, the decision to abandon versus repair, the movement of ritual centers inland. Each voice trimmed the possibilities and left a slightly different silhouette of the past. One contentious claim centered on a carved map incised faintly on a slab, a map that some read as a navigational plan, others as a ritual diagram. The slab's lines corresponded, if examined upside down, to a known harbor's layout. Was this evidence of a planned harbor reconfiguration? A ritual map that functioned on both practical and symbolic levels? Scholars published competing articles, each with cautious hedging and precise footnotes. The debate attracted public attention, and soon the conversation extended beyond journals into documentary segments and op-ed pages, where nuance risks being lost to headlines. Amid academic sparring, human stories quietly persisted. A young conservator who had grown up in the region found on a morning dive a small token that matched a family heirloom described by his grandmother. The discovery was a private reconciliation between personal history and professional obligation. He later wrote, in a note tucked into the project's archive, that archaeology sometimes returns more than objects, it returns parts of identity. Technology continued to surprise. A drone-mounted LiDAR scan of the shore, combined with bathymetric mapping, produced a three-dimensional model showing how a coastal ridge once formed a sheltered lagoon, an ideal harbor, before sedimentation shifted channels. The model suggested why certain neighborhoods clustered where they did, and why a temple would be placed at that specific angle to catch morning light. Architecture, it seems, listened to the sun as much as to the sea. LiDAR and bathymetry synthesis. In one late-night session in the lab, researchers ran a radiocarbon series on charcoal recovered from a sealed context. The dates clustered tightly within a range of 2 decades, a startlingly precise window. It suggested construction or a major renovation had occurred during a short period, perhaps as part of an imperial project or a wealthy patron's program. Dating with such resolution reanimated names on inscriptions. A patron mentioned in an inland archive now had a chronological plausibility. Connections that once belonged to speculative footnotes climbed towards certainty. Yet for every precision, ambiguity remained. A slab with a deliberately erased inscription posed a historian's puzzle. Was the erasure political, a damnatio memoriae, or practical, perhaps to reuse the stone? The act of erasure is itself an argument about memory and power. It tells us who was permitted to be remembered and who was not. Some hypotheses were more fragile than they seemed. An initial reading of a frieze as depicting a solar procession later became contested when pigment analysis showed additives that suggested it was painted centuries after the carving. Was the frieze repainted in a revival? Or did pigment migration fool the senses? Analytical chemistry can both clarify and complicate. Yet the human rhythms of devotion gave the site its most telling signs. Festive debris, large quantities of amphorae deliberately broken, animal bones arranged in patterns, pointed to public rituals that likely mark seasonal transitions, harvest, seafaring season, the memory of a drowning. The material signature of ritual is rarely tidy, it is palimpsest and improvisation. But when patterns repeat across sites, a ritual architecture begins to emerge. Ethically, the team debated what to bring to the surface. Some argued for exhaustive recovery, others for leaving the site largely intact, a submerged museum protected by sea and silence. The compromise leaned towards selective recovery for threatened contexts, and in situ preservation for the rest. Each removed object required a conservation plan, a secure chain of custody, and a commitment to public access, whether through local exhibitions or digital repositories. Conservation itself was an art of patience. The desalination tanks were long and precise. Objects bathed in fresh water, measured conductivity dropping by degrees. Bronze required electrolytic reduction to stabilize corrosion. Pigments demanded consolidants applied with microscope needles. Those processes were slow, expensive, and often heartbreaking. Sometimes a flake of color would fall away despite every precaution. Saving the material, the team learned, sometimes means accepting that some details will be lost. Public presentation shaped the modern afterlife of the temple. A traveling exhibition curated artifacts alongside interactive digital reconstructions that allowed visitors to swim through the submerged city. The exhibition's narrative tried to balance mystery and method. It wanted to thrill, but not at the cost of accuracy. Visitors left with printed cards bearing the ring-sigil and a short text that read, "We may never know everything. We can, however, keep asking." Stories multiplied. Fiction writers wove romances set against the drowned arches. A musician composed a lament incorporating field recordings of the sea at the site. Those creative responses were not distractions. They were other forms of engagement that kept the ruins alive within cultural memory. And yet, the ruins continued to ask questions. Why did the ring sigil persist so insistently? Why were some temples intentionally dismantled while others retained care? How did shifting trade routes alter ritual economies? Each answered question opened new doorways. One winter, an amateur historian sent the team a photocopy of a 17th century map annotated in a script that matched a local dialect. The annotation mentioned the night when the stones fled the shore. The phrase could be poetic shorthand for an event or a memory of a ritualized retelling. The archive's marginalia multiplied possibilities and reminded scholars that human words, even when unsystematic, are a form of evidence when read with care. If you stand now on the empty slope where the temple's rooftop once crowned the town, you can still feel the contours of absence. See birds carve the wind, fishermen mend nets, and the outline of the submerged city waits beneath green glass. The past is not a place you go but a presence you carry. It reshapes how the present makes sense. No one knows the final phrase of this city's story. We can assemble chapters, infer sequences, propose causes, and reject others. The archaeological record does not yield a single narrative. It offers a chorus of voices, sediment, inscription, object, oral memory, that sing overlapping songs. Perhaps that is fitting. Temples are, after all, places of layered meanings. They held public ritual and private devotion, commerce and identity. Their submergence was not a single event but a process of things, environmental shifts, economic decisions, political violence, and human adaptation. Each played its role. When the team closed its field season, they left temporary markers on the seabed, discrete buoys for protection and transponders that would let future researchers return to exact coordinates. The markers were small, technical, almost embarrassingly mundane compared to the grandeur of carved stones. Yet they were practical commitments to continued study, to the slow accumulation of knowledge, to the stewardship of places that do not belong to any one generation. Back on shore, a child pressed a shell to a notebook and drew concentric circles. Her circle was not the ring sigil but a child's echo of it, neat, hopeful, insisting. Perhaps that is the truest evidence of continuity. The human desire to mark meaning on the world, to leave loops that others can trace. If you stood at that ancient altar, brush in hand, brushing silt from a bowl, what would you place there now? A coin? A flower? A question? The gesture matters less than the intent, to remember, to honor, to keep the conversation between past and present alive. The sea keeps its own counsel, but it gives gifts if we know how to ask. Stone and bone and broken pottery are not silent. They speak in slow grammars, in residues and tool marks, in erosion and deposition. Our task is to learn their tongue with humility and precision. As the years pass, new surveys will add pixels to the map. New analyses will refine chronologies. New conversations with local communities will deepen ethical practices. The temple will not surrender all its secrets at once. It will unfold in patience, in argument, in wonder. For now, the rings remain, carved, painted, echoed in a child's drawing. They circle outward, connecting sea and land, memory and material, the ancient and the living present. Each circle is an invitation. No one knows the last word. The enigma deepens, and in that deepening we continue to look, to ask, and to listen. Tide and time arrange themselves into a rhythm the field team learns to read, a patterned patience that asks the researcher to slow down and listen. At night on deck, with the sea breathing cold mist, the lead archaeologist pins a photo of the doorway to her notebook like a talisman, and murmurs the dates and coordinates, as if memorizing a prayer. The crew jokes that she sleeps with the map under her pillow. She does not laugh. The excavation yielded small miracles in the weeks that followed. A string of glass beads threaded on a fragile fiber, the faint impression of woven cloth on a ceramic rim, a tiny comb of bone whose teeth were worn smooth by a child's hand. Each object reopened a line into everyday life. They were not the spectacular idols that make headlines. They were the quiet, quotidian things that show how people loved, labored, feared, and hoped. In their accumulation, ordinary objects became a chorus that sang louder than a single monumental statue. Why do we fall for monuments when the truth often lives in the small things? Because monuments are shorthand for mastery. Because they are easy to point at. But potsherds and whistles teach us about routine, the slow mechanics of living. The temple's public face was carved stone and friezes. Its private one was the child's whistle tucked into a seam. Which is truer? Both are. Both are necessary. Mapping the site required stitching together data from different instruments into a single, navigable reality. Photogrammetry produced a mosaic of millions of tiny photographs stitched into a seamless 3D model. Sonar offered a top-down skeleton, diver sketches filled in the tactile flesh. The model let scholars walk virtually through the ruined streets with a freedom they could not while treading the silt. It also exposed errors, misinterpreted alignments, assumed thresholds that vanished under closer scrutiny. The digital model became a conversation partner. It corrected human bias and revealed new questions. Photogrammetry, side-scan sonar synthesis. At the core of the city was a plaza paved with worn stones, their surfaces concave where generations trod. In one corner of that plaza, a recessed niche showed evidence of repeated burning, layers upon layers of ash separated by thin films of sediment. The pattern suggested ritual repetition, possibly seasonal offerings left in cyclical observance. Charred seeds found within the ash, when analyzed, matched a crop rotation recorded in an inland tax tablet, a rare cross-confirmation between material residue and written record. Archaeobotany, archival cross-reference, the motif of the ring-sigil had another life beyond stone. Fishermen told stories of a ring of lights that appeared offshore on certain nights, circular and steady, unlike bioluminescent flare. They described low, humming sounds when the lights appeared, like a bell heard through water. Scientists sampled the water and measured currents and plankton concentrations. The physical explanations were plausible, converging currents concentrating organisms that bioluminesce under agitation. But the locals insisted on the old name and the old meaning. How should a scientist read such testimony? As data, metaphor, or both? We learn to record those stories as ethnographic evidence, and to treat them not as supernatural claims but as cultural artifacts that instruct on perception and memory. A marked breakthrough came when a conservator, mid-morning in the lab, noticed a faint underlayer of pigment on a column fragment. The pigment, revealed only after careful cleaning, traced a painted motif that echoed a textile fragment's weave pattern found elsewhere on the site. The correlation suggested color schemes were purposeful and recurrent, a palette connecting architecture and apparel. Perhaps priests wore garments painted to match the temple's walls, creating a visual theology where built and worn environments mirrored one another. Pigment analysis, textile correlation, the discovery shifted interpretive emphasis toward performance. Temples are stages where movement, color, scent, and sound converge to make ritual convincing. A painted column is not just decoration, it is an actor in a drama, catching morning light and framing gesture. When we imagine ancient ritual, we often think of static rites. The material evidence pushed back. Ritual was performance, immersive and sensory. The maps and models also revealed a surprising urbanism. Streets led not only to the temple but away from it toward quays and industrial quarters. Amphorae shards were concentrated near a particular jetty, showing intensive storage and transfer activity. A block of buildings with heavy hearth residues suggested artisanal production, perhaps dyeing or tanning, directly adjacent to spaces with ritual deposits. The city's zoning was a mosaic of commerce, craft, and devotion, and the temple stood as one node among many. Trade left chemical signatures. Isotope analysis of fish bones indicated some species were local, others imported from distant waters. The presence of non-local species suggests elite dining, long-distance trade connections, and a palate that crossed ecological boundaries. Exotic goods, glass from far coasts, metals worked in distinctive ways, surfaced in contexts that implied both wealth and cosmopolitan tastes. The ring-sigils seemed to mark a civic identity that embraced both local anchorage and broad horizon. Isotopic analysis, trade ceramics, not every find gladdened the heart. A layer of human remains in a disordered deposit produced osteological evidence of violent death, blunt force trauma, and cut marks consistent with weapon blows. The spatial context suggested a hurried burial, perhaps of victims from a sudden attack or a collapse. The image of a city both worshipful and assaulted reframed narratives of passive decline into ones where agency, human conflict, perhaps political strife, played a role. Violence was not merely episodic, it left marks in bone and in the urban fabric. Osteologists argued for caution. Paramortem marks could indicate anything from combat to structural collapse. The debate circled back to context and chronology, and every bone became a contested witness. Osteological analysis. At the heart of public debate lay a slab called the circle map. It was small and portable, carved with concentric rings and radial lines. Scholars read it variously as a celestial diagram, a chart of seasonal fishing zones, or a property map. One maritime archaeologist proposed it was an encoded harbor plan, delineating currents and safe anchorage, a cipher for pilots. A cultural historian countered that the slab's ritual deposition suggested symbolic, not practical, function. Neither interpretation could yet claim dominance. The slab was evidence of layered meaning, functional and symbolic possibilities intertwined. In its ambiguity lay an invitation, and a warning against simple answers. The film crews that began to arrive on the scene complicated fieldwork with the demand for narrative clarity. Producers sought a tidy plot, hero researchers, villainous looters, the moment of discovery captured on camera. The team navigated these pressures by insisting on transparency. They opened lab hours to journalists but curated access. They filmed processes, desalination tanks, microscope work, rather than sensational lifting scenes. Public outreach succeeded when it respected complexity. Viewers learned more when shown methods rather than melodrama. Education became a parallel excavation. The project's outreach coordinator ran workshops with schoolchildren where they made clay tokens using ancient techniques. The children asked straightforward, timeless questions. Did people there play? What did they believe about the sea? Could they visit? The hands-on workshops made history's abstract threads tangible. Young visitors left with small clay impressions stamped with rings, heirs in their own right to the sigil. Meanwhile, satellite imagery surfaced an unexpected clue, a pattern of buried channels leading into the bay that matched tidal models of centuries past. Once, the coast had been braided with creeks and wetlands that formed a sheltered approach to the city's harbors. The channel morphology explained why the city's builders had chosen that site. Beyond spiritual considerations, they had been brilliant practical engineers of place. Satellite geomorphology. A diplomat from the coastal region's cultural ministry visited the site and sat quietly on the deck for hours, watching the live ROV feed. She later confided that family stories had always referred to the night the lamps dived, a phrase that now read like an echo of catastrophic flooding. Her presence reminded the team that archaeology does not exist in a vacuum. It is embedded in living polity, law, and identity. State involvement unlocked funding and protection but also introduced bureaucratic language into the field's quieter dialects. Conservation confronted an intractable choice when the excavators located a mural partially preserved behind incrustation. Lifting it intact would require removing enormous overburden and building a scaffold in a hostile environment. Leaving it would risk continued decay. After an ethics review that included local stakeholders, the team opted for high-resolution documentation in situ and selective lifting of diagnostic fragments for study and display. The decision balanced knowledge and stewardship, but it was not without sorrow. Sometimes doing right meant letting certain fragments sink back to silence to preserve their integrity. Academic publication followed, as it must. Articles appeared with dense tables and cautious subjunctives. Peer review sharpened arguments and weeded out haste. At conferences, the team presented models that allowed colleagues to walk the submerged plazas. Questions about chronology and cultural affiliation were urgent and iterative. One session devolved briefly into a debate over terminology. Should the site be called a temple town or a harbor complex with ritual installations? Terminology carried interpretive weight. The naming debate reflected larger methodological choices. The sea occasionally returned oddities that seemed to resist neat classification. A carved plaque depicting a boat with oars that rowed in pairs but also showed stylized fish rows beneath. a hybrid iconography that might encode both practical seamanship and a mythic charter. Iconography, the team realized, fused the pragmatic and the sacred. Images served as mnemonic devices for pilots and as invocations for those invoking a god's favor. This duality unsettled as much as it clarified. Field seasons cycled by. Each return brought new questions and the occasional satisfying closure. A line of stamps in a ledger matched a group of amphorae. Radiocarbon dates tightened a sequence. A conservator's careful patience revealed a textile pattern that confirmed a hypothesized trade link. Other mysteries multiplied. The ring-sigil refused to yield a one-line translation. If anything, it expanded to signal affiliations across classes and contexts. A surprising social turn came when fishermen, initially skeptical of archaeologists, began to monitor the protected zones. The project trained them to identify illegal trawling and gave them small conservation incentives. Farmers near the coast received soil stabilization advice that reduced erosion near known heritage points. Conservation thus became coextensive with community resilience. Heritage management cannot flourish without local buy-in. Preservation and livelihood entwined, and the project became, in part, a resource for both. The team also wrestled with the ethics of publicizing certain finds. Some objects had clear religious significance to contemporary communities who live along the shore. Before exhibiting those items, the team consulted community leaders. They agreed on display protocols that included rituals of thanks and context panels explaining why the object was shown. Community voice reshaped curation, shifting display from conquest of the past to conversation with the past. Scholarly rivals offered alternative narratives. One competing team published a paper arguing the temple was part of a defensive network against piracy. Their evidence was a line of submerged watchtowers recorded in sonar that seemed to form a chain along the coast. The defensive model made sense in an age of contested maritime routes. It also complicated the idea of temples as purely religious spaces. Defense, trade, ritual. The city's life was hybrid, its boundaries porous. In the quiet hours of analysis, the principal investigator wrote long, reflective notes about scale. She wondered whether modern concepts of city, temple, and economy might impose artificial separations not present in local modes of thought. Perhaps, temple was a convenient shorthand for a place that in lived reality was government office, market, shrine, archive, and social center all at once. Labels, she wrote, are instruments, not truths. They help us think but can also blind us. That awareness informed how the team presented the site to the public, not as a puzzle to be solved but as a multilayered conversation. Exhibitions included audio recordings of local elders telling myths, maps showing trade connections, and tactile displays where visitors could handle replicas of whistles and beads. The aim was empathy, not triumphalism. Meanwhile, the sea kept making new demands. Storm seasons intensified, and protective transponders required maintenance. Bleaching events altered local ecologies, affecting reef growth that sheltered the ruins. Conservation adapted to changing environmental realities. Climate science entered daily planning. The team collaborated with oceanographers to model future exposure risks and to plan adaptive strategies. Heritage in the Anthropocene is inherently proactive, requiring interdisciplinary coordination across hard science and social negotiation. Climate modeling collaboration, and the ring-sigil endured. Children copied it in the margins of schoolbooks. An artisan produced a line of ceramics inspired by its form. An indie band used it on an album cover. Symbols have afterlives that exceed archaeological intent. They migrate into new aesthetics and new economies. That migration complicates ownership. The sigil belongs to no single domain. It is now at once ancient motif, modern brand, and communal memory. As fieldwork matured, a regional synthesis began to appear. The submerged temples along that coast were not monolithic. They represented a spectrum of site types and histories. Some sank quickly after seismic events, others declined over centuries as economy and environment shifted. Some were repurposed and partially dismantled, others were kept and ritual continued inland on raised ground. The synthesis resisted a single narrative but offered a framework. Water is both destructor and preserver. Human agency is persistent and adaptive. Ritual and commerce are braided. If you find yourself moved by the image of a diver kneeling in green light to brush a child's whistle, then you have encountered the story's heart. Not the spectacular, but the intimate. Not the complete answer, but the longing to know. What would you whisper to the sea if you could leave a message for those who lived here? Would you ask forgiveness, ask for knowledge, or simply place a token of your own? The impulse to reach across centuries is universal. The project closed one season with a modest ceremony, a small plaque placed on shore that listed contributors, partners, and a short note pledging continued protection. The plaque read not as an ending but as a commitment. For future scholars, for local stewards, for the restless memory of place. It was humble and necessary. Yet endings are temporary. New students arrived with fresh questions and sharper tools. An ethnographer obtained oral histories that recalibrated interpretive assumptions. A materials chemist proposed a new method to detect dye residues in waterlogged fibers. The archaeology of the submerged temples became a living field again, not a closed case file but an open invitation. The sea keeps its counsel, but each season we pry open a new hinge in the past. We map, we analyze, we argue, and we listen. The city beneath the waves resists simple closure. And in that resistance we find a humbling reminder. History is not a solved equation. It is a conversation extended across generations. If, as you watch this story, you feel a tug, curiosity, sadness, wonder, know that those feelings are the researcher's currency. They propel us back into the water, into the labs, into the archives where we keep asking, who built this? Why here? How did they live? What do these stones ask of us? We press the questions because the answers matter, for history, for identity, and for the living communities whose coasts still host these silent witnesses. A gull collapses into wind and then recovers, as if remembering both water and sky. A diver's gloved hand traces a groove and finds a faint leaf impression, a moment where breath and time align. They named the channel where that leaf lay, the seam, because the city's geometry seemed stitched together there, a narrow inlet, flanked by wharves, bending like an elbow to shelter boats. The scene sheltered more than vessels. It sheltered rituals that mixed the smell of salt with the smoke of burned offerings. In the quiet hours the site felt less like a ruin and more like a paused ceremony waiting for someone to pick up the rhythm. How do you reconstruct a rhythm from broken notes? Sound matters in water as much as sight. Acoustic surveys recorded low-frequency hums that the team at first catalogued as boat noise and distant surf. Later, analysis suggested a different layering: natural ambient sounds, seasonal rain pulses, and occasional artifacts of human origin, the clack of stacked stones, the scrape of anchors. Sound archives became an unexpected form of context, oral palimpsests that layered ancient activity with modern echoes. Acoustic monitoring. In a weathered chest bought from a seaside antique stall, a field assistant found a folded letter in brittle paper that referenced the ringed hall beneath the bay, and the name of a patron. Ariston. The letter's handwriting matched an ink recipe common in coastal ledgers of the late medieval period, but the content, an almost mythic invocation, suggested that memory of the submerged temple persisted in maritime lore far longer than scholars expected. Oral memory and marginalia had braided into an archival whisper. Could a child's drawing in a merchant's trunk be a key to chronology? Work at the site required that the team borrow from many disciplines. Marine geophysicists modeled sediment flows and potential liquefaction zones. Paleobotanists reconstructed past shorelines from pollen sequences. Conservation scientists tested consolidants on microfragments to avoid long-term chemical instability. Each method introduced its own vocabulary and its own uncertainties. Interdisciplinary work is not merely additive, it is a negotiation where different kinds of evidence must be translated into a shared logic. A critical moment came when DNA analysis on human remains, conducted under strict ethical oversight and with community consult, revealed a surprising pattern: individuals with mitochondrial lineages pointing to both coastal and inland ancestries, mixed across burial strata. The genetic mosaic confirmed what isotopes hinted at: mobility and intermarriage between port and hinterland. People were not sealed to shores, They moved through networks, carrying new practices and sacred objects. Genetic data does not tell stories alone, but it can reweave demographic threads that material culture only hints at. Ancient DNA analysis, ethical community consultation, the political context shifted too. A regional election brought leaders who saw heritage as both pride and a potential economic lever. Funding appeared and then was tethered to rapid deliverables, exhibitions, promotional films, quick-turn archaeological reconstructions. That pleased tourists. The team resisted the temptation to theatricalize. They insisted on showing uncertainty, on framing timelines and hypotheses rather than tidy certainties. Heritage, they argued, should not be a glossy postcard, it should be an honest mirror. At the center of the site lay a peculiar construction, a platform of dressed stone set into a natural outcrop, its edges cut with precision and its center slightly concave. Divers found that the platform had drainage channels leading seawards, a subtle engineering that suggested knowledge of tidal patterns and microhydrology. Perhaps it was a place of ritual immersion, designed to let seawater wash offerings outward while keeping the central area accessible. The platform's design merged worship with hydraulic skill, a ritual architecture that negotiated the sea's moods. Structural analysis, hydrodynamic modeling. Elsewhere, a tessellated pavement bore a cluster of cupules, small hemispherical depressions pecked into stone. Cupules are found in many cultures and often defy singular meaning. They may be grinding basins, percussion markers, or symbolic offerings. In this pavement, residue analysis from within several cupules found traces of aromatic resins and marine fish oils. The combination suggested ritual acts that used both land-derived incense and sea-derived offerings, a ritual language meant to reconcile earth and ocean. What does it mean to pray with a fish oil lamp? The ring-sigil, the symbol that threaded through architecture and pottery, took on new valences when researchers noticed its scaled gradations on ceramics, small rings stamped on servant-class bowls and complex concentric carvings on elite altars. The symbol adapted to social scale, suggesting it functioned as both identity marker and a flexible iconography for different social registers. A ring on a coarse cup might indicate civic affiliation, deep concentric inlays on a temple slab might encode cosmological ideas. Symbols are plastic, they bend to social needs. In the wet lab, a conservator found micropollen trapped beneath a compacted layer of resin in a bowl fragment. The pollen matched a plant species from a mountain valley many days inland by foot, a plant used in pastoral rituals. The presence of upland pollen in a coastal sacrifice suggested deliberate exchange, pilgrimages, gifts, or the movement of specialists carrying sacred botanicals across environments. The ritual life of the temple drew on many ecologies, weaving hill and shore into a single ceremonial map. Palynology, residue analysis, public response took unpredictable turns. A local collective staged a performance on the shoreline invoking the temple stories, combining contemporary music with recorded underwater sounds. The performance drew both enthusiastic crowds and conservative critique. Some elders loved the reclaiming of memory. Others argued that ritual reenactments risked aestheticizing sacred practice. The conversation revealed tensions between living culture and heritage commodification. Heritage, the team learned, lives in contested negotiations. The city's epigraphic record yielded another eyebrow-raising find, a fragmentary tablet with a calendar list of maritime festivals tied to lunar phases. The calendar's structure matched the cyclic nature of the ring-sigil, concentric rings as lunar cycles. If the tablet's reading held, the ring-sigil might function both as an emblem and as a mnemonic for calendrical observances related to fishing season, pilgrimage windows, and civic feasts. A symbol, like any tool, operates on multiple levels. Inscription analysis, lunar calendrical correlation, yet chronology remained thorny. Different dating methods produced ranges that sometimes overlapped and sometimes diverged. Optically stimulated luminescence on certain buried sands suggested earlier occupation than the radiocarbon series from organic remains. The discrepancy forced a re-examination of stratigraphic associations. Were sands redeposited by storm events? Post-depositional processes complicated a neat timeline. Archaeology is as much about interrogating the record's formation as it is about cataloging artifacts. The team confronted the politics of repatriation openly. Artifacts recovered during an earlier, poorly regulated dig had been sold abroad. International partners negotiated with museums and private collectors to repatriate items, and those negotiations were complex, legal, and morally fraught. The returned objects were reintegrated into the narrative but also carried the stain of extraction. The team used repatriation moments as teaching opportunities about context and the violence of object removal. Ownership debates are not merely legal, they are ethical conversations about memory and stewardship. A smaller, human tableau reshaped everyone's perspective, a pair of bracelets discovered together at the base of a collapsed threshold, one of simple bronze and the other intricately woven of colored glass. Their juxtaposition suggested companionship across social lines, gifts exchanged perhaps between sailors and inland kin, or tokens of shared vows. The material differences in the bracelets sparked speculation about gender roles, gift economies, and social networks. The personal scale of such artifacts often outshone grand architectural statements for their ability to humanize the ancient inhabitants. Artists contributed to interpretation in surprising ways. A sculptor invited to the site produced a series of tactile casts of worn steps and handholds, translating erosional patterns into touchable art pieces. Visitors, blind and sighted, handled the casts, experiencing ancient wear through contemporary touch. The installation reframed accessibility and sensory engagement, reminding the public that ruins were not just visual. Material culture appeals to multiple senses beyond the eye. Meanwhile, conservationists wrestled with biofilms that colonized stone surfaces. Microbial communities formed colorful patinas. Some microbes aided calcification and helped bind loose surfaces, while others contributed to decay. Manipulating these tiny ecologies required careful experiments to avoid unintended consequences. A treatment that killed one microbe might invite another, more destructive community. The lab became a microbiologist's theater, with petri dishes and incubators as props in an ongoing experiment in stewardship. Biofilm research. One unanticipated discovery was a set of small, deliberately broken mirrors found within a ritual deposit. The mirrors were of polished bronze, thin and hand-filed, intended not for vanity but for reflective ritual, catching dawn light or reflecting the image of the sea into the temple. Mirrors in many cultures mediate between worlds. Here they might have been used to fold the sea's light into stone, to make the boundary permeable. Objects can be metaphors made tangible. At the pedagogical center, a digital reconstruction allowed a user to light virtual lamps and see how painted columns changed appearance through the day. The simulation demonstrated something obvious and profound: ritual aesthetics are time-sensitive. Paint and light combine differently at dawn versus dusk. Gestures that matter at high noon shift in low light. The lived experience of ritual is temporal, anchored to cycles of sun and tide. Technology allowed a partial reconstitution of those experiences. The media interest continued, and with it came both support and distortion. Clickbait headlines favored supernatural angles. Lost Temple of the Sea God? The team countered by offering transparent datasets and inviting journalists to methodological workshops. They found that teaching the public how archaeologists know what they know reduced sensationalism and built trust. Transparency, within reason, was a prophylactic against myth-making. A late-season storm battered the coast and washed silt over previously exposed features. The team scrambled to protect vulnerable contexts with sandbags and temporary coverings. It was a visceral reminder that fieldwork is a dialogue with unpredictable forces. The sea could reveal and erase with equal, indifferent agency. Responding to weather became as central to field planning as lab protocols and grant cycles. Scholarly debates matured into a draft monograph that argued for a plural model. The temples functioned as nodes in a maritime civic system that fused ritual, commerce, and hydraulic engineering. The monograph did not close the case. Instead, it offered frameworks and posed further questions about identity, ritual scale, and cross-ecological exchange. Good scholarship, the team found, often expands the map of inquiry rather than shrinking it. Conservation produced a small public gallery where stabilized artifacts, the child's whistle, the twin bracelets, a painted column fragment, were displayed with narrative panels that emphasized process over conclusion. Visitors could scan QR codes to access datasets, watch conservators at work via live feeds, and read community voices. The gallery attempted to democratize knowledge, moving it from specialist journals into a civic commons. Late one autumn evening, an elderly storyteller visited the gallery and said simply, "We always thought the sea kept one house for itself." Her sentence was not a scientific claim but a way of locating grief and continuity. The team's work, she suggested, was as much about recognizing shared loss as it was about reconstructing timelines. Memory, local voice, and technical inquiry interwove to produce a story that honored both method and feeling. What remains is a constellation of questions that will guide future work, the precise socio-political mechanisms that led to selective dismantling of certain temples, the full meaning spectrum of the ring sigil in domestic versus elite contexts, the ways climate variability and human agency combine to reshape coastlines and livelihoods. Each question is a doorway, and each doorway opens onto more corridors. If you stood on the reef at dusk, listening to the sea breathe against ancient stones, which question would you bring to the light? Would it be about gods, or trade, or the simple human acts of keeping and forgetting? The sea may not answer, but it will listen, and in its listening, it preserves traces, waits for careful hands, and invites the living to keep asking. A gull threads the dawn like a seamstress dragging a single white stitch across gray cloth. Its cry splits the quiet, and the team below decks jokes about omens that only sea people understand. The ocean answers with a slow, indifferent lapping that feels less like sound and more like a state of being. The next dive revealed details the cameras had missed: micro-chiseling along an architrave, a hairline inlay of shell in a decorative groove, a fingerprint preserved in calcite where a potter's thumb had once smoothed clay. Those tiny marks changed how the team imagined hands at work, not anonymous labor but specific practitioners with habits and preferences. A thumbprint or a tool mark is a signature smaller than a name yet more intimate. Hands that smelled of tar and thyme, hands that steadied a child's whistling toy while a mother tied a knot. In the quiet of the lab, conservators studied residues under microscopes and slowly reconstructed not only objects but gestures. On the quay at low tide, fishermen told of seasonal markers, floating plumes of foam that presaged shoals of certain fish, a wind that always came from the east on market days. Their knowledge was practical and particular. It had saved nets and, on occasion, lives. Archaeologists recorded these oral calendars as field data because human practices shaped the landscape over generations. A fisher's calendar stitched into sediment becomes, in time, a stratigraphic signature. If you close your eyes and picture the city in its fullness, smell the smoke of hearths, the resin of lamps, the salt of drying fish, what else do you see? Do you see processions, priests in painted robes, children darting between columns? Or do you see mundane daily life, artisans patching roofs, merchants bargaining, fishermen mending nets? The evidence insists on both images, braided like rope. Religion and economy are not separate spheres but overlapping practices that shaped when and how people acted. Researchers found traces of pigments so well preserved that, when photographed in ultraviolet, vivid reds and deep lapis tones glowed like hidden constellations. The painted surfaces suggested color schemes more elaborate than scholars had imagined. Columns were not the pale stone modern eyes expect but were bright, patterned, and theatrical. Color changes how gesture reads in space. It turns thresholds into stages and processions into moving patterns of light and fabric. The revelation reframed the temple not as mere architecture but as a theater of belief. A slender archive fragment, a tax receipt on vellum bled at the edges, mentioned a payment to the lamp keepers for oil delivered on certain days. Cross-referencing that record with residue analysis from recovered lamp fragments suggested an institutional maintenance of ritual lighting. Someone kept calendars, measured and rationed fuel, and thus ritual was not spontaneous but organized. Institutions, even on a small scale, anchor communal practices over time. In the lab, A conservator who had spent months with a silk-crusted bowl finally coaxed out an inner ring of incised marks. The pattern was a subtle spiral, faint and precise. Comparative study found the same spiral stamped on a set of clinker-built boat ribs recovered from an offshore wreck. The spiral moved from pottery to wood, from altar to ship. It crossed material boundaries and suggested a shared visual language that knitted sea and shrine together. Symbols are not static, they transfer, and in doing so they reveal networks. Not all networks were benign. Evidence of defensive structures, a low embankment reinforced with pilings, a line of stones that could have supported wooden barriers, hinted at fear of attack or the need to protect maritime approaches. Traces of burned layers and domestic strata, arrowheads mixed with hearth refuse, and a sudden shift in artifact assemblages suggested episodes of conflict. A maritime city is not inherently peaceful. Its wealth invites contestation, and its shores are a stage for both commerce and conflict. The material record resisted romantic simplifications. A small bone flute, found near a domestic hearth and cleaned with painstaking patience, produced a tone when conservators tested it with a soft reed. The tone was thin and plaintive, like a reed calling across low water. Music, the team realized, had been part of daily life: lullabies, shanties, liturgical recitations. Sound, ephemeral by nature, leaves traces in patterning and wear. The flute's traces rewove the city's sonic life into the archaeological narrative. Across seasons, patterns consolidated. Certain neighborhoods specialized in craft, others in storage and trade, and the temple plaza acted as a centripetal force, where production met display and ritual met exchange. A single amphora could travel from a distant kiln to the temple altar, and then be broken deliberately to mark a festival. Objects flowed through different social circuits, meaning accumulated in trajectories rather than in isolated contexts. The people of the region began to see themselves reflected in the project's work. A local teacher organized school trips. Students held claymaking sessions and then asked to volunteer on the site. One teenager, whose grandfather had once claimed the temple stones were the bones of giants, wrote an essay connecting family lore to the archaeologist's findings. Heritage work became a civic mirror, a way for communities to see their past in ways that resonated with contemporary identities. Science continued to push the envelope. A materials lab adapted methods from art conservation to detect ground pigments in waterlogged fabrics. A geophysics group used time-lapse bathymetry to note subtle sediment migrations that altered microhabitats. Each technical advance produced a richer picture but also new puzzles. Why did decorative programs shift abruptly in certain layers? Why did certain neighborhoods receive more imported material despite their distance from the main quay? The record insisted that social inequality, patronage, and trade were woven into the city's life. One night, in the field tent, two young archaeologists argued passionately over a small fragment with painted stripes. One believed it to be a votive sash. The other thought it a merchant's token sewn into garments for identification. Their disagreement surprised them both. They had assumed consensus, and they realized how much modern categories shape interpretation. Scholars must remain vigilant against their own preconceptions. Every artifact is at risk of being read into familiar narratives. At the waterline, a community elder taught a small circle how to recognize the ring-sigil carved into living rocks where waves still wash. She explained its uses in blessing nets and naming seasons. Her granddaughter recorded the lesson on a smartphone, and the recording later became part of the site's public archive. Digital tools thus mediated tradition, preserving memory in new media while keeping the practice alive among younger generations. The team faced a tense ethical debate when a well-intentioned donor offered funds for accelerated excavation under the condition of a dramatic televised reveal. The principal investigator declined, arguing that speed and spectacle can erode context and meaning. The board later supported a compromise, funding for outreach and educational programming, not for rush digs. The moment clarified priorities: stewardship over spectacle, depth over headline. A marine biologist on the team noticed that certain barnacle species preferentially colonized carved grooves, accentuating them into new textures. The interplay between biology and artifact created an unplanned palimpsest, a living fossilization where the organism's growth became part of the object's patina. Conservators debated whether to remove such growths. Some argued that the biofilm integrated with the object's post-depositional history and thus had interpretive value. Preservation is a negotiation between the material past and the living present. On a quieter level, the team began to map personal networks implicit in gift exchange. A cluster of imported beads at a domestic hearth suggested a family's connection to maritime trade. A sequence of small, locally made tokens hinted at gifting practices among neighbors. Network analysis, borrowed from social science, allowed researchers to visualize connections between households and between the temple and its hinterland. The city, once a static ruin, turned into an animate web of relations. A contentious discovery complicated public relations. A stone slab containing what some read as glyphs that might belong to a writing system. Others saw them as ritual shorthand or even graffiti. Prize media outlets called for definitive readings, while specialists cautioned patience. The team's measured approach, publish the data, avoid speculation, invite peer review, paid off when an epigrapher proposed a plausible comparative analysis linking the markings to a nearby but poorly understood script. The slab's story advanced slowly but with scientific rigor. Throughout, ritual practice remained central in interpretation. Whether the ring-sigils signaled lunar cycles, guild identity, or metaphysical concepts, it consistently appeared at points of convergence, thresholds, offering basins, and amphora stamps. Symbols, the team learned, operate rhythmically, repeated in daily gestures, public ceremonies, and inherited styles, and these repetitions create cultural memory. As field seasons accumulated, the city's afterlife diversified. Artists, musicians, and educators used the ring sigil as an emblem of place while respecting its archaeological roots. Some activists used heritage discourse to lobby for coastal protections. Entrepreneurs sold tasteful ceramic reproductions at the local market, and a local chef served a seasonal dish inspired by archaeological finds, prompting a debate about authenticity versus creative homage. Heritage, the team observed, never stays confined to archives. It spills into living economies and cultural practices. Storms continued to test conservation limits. One violent winter surge exposed a new facade of masonry that, days later, collapsed under the same battering. The team reacted quickly, documenting and salvaging what they could while acknowledging some loss was unavoidable. The sea teaches humility. Every season offers both gifts of discovery and reminders of impermanence. In quiet moments, team members shared simple rituals of their own, laying a small wreath of local flowers on a protected marker, taking a moment of silence for people long dead, and sometimes, late at night, talking about which artifacts they would most like to keep for themselves, not as property but as talismans of memory. These gestures echoed the ancient offerings once laid at the temple, humble acts that link hands across centuries. Which question would you place on the altar now? One about identity, climate, trade, or the small domestic acts that make a life? Each answer opens a different conversation, and each conversation invites a different research path. The city beneath the waves will keep offering hints, and as long as we keep asking, the dialogue continues. Salt and shadow braid at the edge of a carved step, and for a moment the team holds its breath as if the stone might speak. A single scalloped shell lies inverted on the lip, like a small, accidental offering from a tide that remembers how to be generous. The archaeologists kept returning to the same uneasy juxtaposition, things of intimate domestic scale placed within monumental contexts. A child's whistle found near the altar, bracelets tucked beneath a paving slab, a coarse cooking pot in a niche beside a painted pilaster. These placements suggested not a separation between sacred and profane but a continuum, a social geography where piety and pantries shared thresholds. The blending complicated tidy categories. Was the temple primarily a place of gods, or was it a household projected into stone? The material argued for entanglement rather than exclusivity. Night on the research vessel condensed thought. Radios whispered coordinates like liturgies. Charts glowed under lamplight. The lead conservator sketched pigment fragments by hand when the scanner refused to capture a faint lapis trace. She liked the intimacy of pencil on paper after months of microscopes and scanners. Fieldwork, she said quietly, is a sequence of small rebellions against loss, a careful scrub here, a patient soak there. Those small acts accumulate into rescue. An amateur diver reported finding a carved bench on a nearby reef several months after the team left for the off-season. The discovery reopened debates about site boundaries and the reach of ritual space into tidal zones. If benches and altars extended into intertidal areas, then ritual practice may have actively engaged changing waterlines, an embodied theology of flux. Did worshippers time their processions with tides, stepping into ankle-deep water at certain hours as part of a covenant with the sea? The idea suggested a lived rituality that embraced, rather than resisted, change. The lab's chemical assays returned another surprising result: traces of aromatic compounds in lamp residues that matched not only inland plant species but also algae-derived compounds. Ritual scent, apparently, mixed land-based incense with the literal essence of the sea. The blend created an embodied olfactory theology, smoke that carried both thyme and salt, a ritual that smelled like the place it inhabited. Ritual, it seemed, used every available register to make meaning: sight, touch, sound, and smell all braided into a single performance. Conservation demanded choices the team did not take lightly. One exposed frieze bore a narrative seen too fragile to lift. It would disintegrate if fully exposed. The compromise, an in-situ protective canopy and high-fidelity scanning, felt like a modern votive, a pledge to future scholars to guard what could not yet be carried away. The canopy's shadow altered how sunlight played across the site, and for a while the frieze appeared like a sleeping beast under a net. Even the act of preservation changed the rhythms of light that ancient builders had once calibrated. Local artisans contributed unexpectedly to understanding construction techniques. A stonemason from a neighboring village recognized a particular chisel pattern and demonstrated it on a block brought to the surface. Watching a living craftsman reproduce marks that matched ancient tool strokes was a rare tandem of epics, past technique and present hand-aligned. The demonstration suggested continuity of craft knowledge across centuries, a material lineage that survives even when names are lost. A satellite survey during a clear window revealed pale lines on the seabed that, when modeled in 3 dimensions, traced a network of submerged channels and artificial embankments. The geometry hinted at deliberate landscape engineering, breakwaters and sluices designed to manage sediment and currents. The builders, it appeared, had been hydraulic thinkers, shaping water as skillfully as they shaped stone. The sea had not simply claimed the city. People had negotiated with it, planned for its moods, and sometimes miscalculated. The ring-sigil surfaced in a new medium, etched into a bronze gaming piece, worn from play. The object's presence in a domestic context suggested that the sigil functioned also as an ordinary life signifier, a tribal mark on toys and tokens that asserted belonging. Playhouses and altars share iconography when community identity is strong. The same looped mark could mark both childhood games and sacred thresholds, binding generations through repeated gesture. Ethnographers documented a festival among coastal villagers that echoed, in form if not in content, some archaeologists' reconstructions, processions along the waterline, offerings thrown on braided ropes, songs that referenced figures half fish, half human. The festival's vocal modes and melodic contours were not direct transcriptions of ancient rites, but they offered living analogues for how the sea could be represented in song. When scholars compared field recordings with iconographic motifs, parallels emerged in rhythm and phrasing, not proof, but suggestive resonance. Cultural memory travels in patterns, not literal transcripts. A contested slab revealed another layer, faint notches along its edge that, after microscopic cleaning, turned out to be a counting system, a simple series of marks likely used for accounting or calendrical tallying. The slab's dual role as a ritual object and an administrative tally complicated the neat divide between sacred and bureaucratic spheres. In many pre-modern societies, administration and ritual were braided, priests counted, and counters prayed. The slab thus served as a reminder: infrastructure and devotion often coexisted in the same material forms. Fieldwork intersected with policy when an offshore development proposal threatened a nearby stretch of seabed. The project team prepared a heritage impact assessment, mobilizing data and models to demonstrate both archaeological value and the social costs of disturbance. The report delayed construction and added conditions. It was an imperfect victory but a concrete demonstration that research could inform governance. Heritage work, in practice, enters legal and economic arenas where the language of significance must translate into regulation and cost-benefit analyses. The researchers began to explore social space through the lens of scent and taste. Lipid residues in bowls, when analyzed, shifted scholars' assumptions about dining practices. A common tableware set contained traces of bitter greens prepared with fish sauce, a flavor profile that crossed social boundaries and suggested shared culinary preferences. Foodways, the team found, are a central axis of identity. What people ate and how they shared meals anchored social networks more reliably than monumental statements. An osteologist presenting at a conference paused to note that scleropathologies pointed to tasks: squatter anesthesia in knees from prolonged kneeling, enthesopathies from heavy load-bearing. Dental were consistent with grit in bread. Bones told work stories: a fisherman's shoulders shaped by hauling nets, a potter's dominant arm altered by repetitive throwing. The human body became an index of daily life rather than an abstraction. Bones record labor histories that text and stone often obscure. A creative exchange occurred when dancers from the nearest town visited the site and staged a movement workshop inspired by the landscape. Dancers improvised sequences based on maps and models, embodying street alignments and thresholds. The movement translated archaeology into kinesthetic knowledge, offering alternative ways to understand how space organized bodies in motion. These embodied experiments generated new hypotheses about procession routes and the choreography of festivals. The project wrestled with digital ethics as well. High-resolution scans and 3D models allow public immersion but also enable illicit replication and commodification. The team implemented access tiers, some models for open educational use, others restricted to research partners, and high-fidelity meshes archived under controlled conditions. The management of digital surrogates became another layer of stewardship: how to share knowledge without enabling exploitation. One unexpected find was a cache of broken shipping tally sticks, wooden tags carved with notches and stamped with civic marks. The tags aligned with ledger entries found in the provincial archive, providing a rare and direct link between material record and bureaucratic paperwork. The tally sticks revealed systems of credit and trust underpinning trade, small technologies of bookkeeping that sustained long-distance exchange. Commerce, the team observed, is as much about trust instruments as it is about goods. A late-season public lecture drew a crowded hall. The lead archaeologist opened with a simple question: "What do you want from the past?" The range of answers, knowledge, pride, tourism, identity, revealed that archaeological work operates within a landscape of public desires. The project, she argued, must answer those desires responsibly, balancing scholarship with community meaning. Heritage is a social contract, and stewardship requires conversation. An interdisciplinary paper proposed a bold synthesis. The submerged temples were nodes in a broader coastal polity that practiced ritualized maritime governance, ceremonies that both marked and regulated access to harbors, fishing zones, and seasonal rites. The theory fused material patterns, inscriptions, and ethnographic parallels into a suggestive framework. Colleagues praised its integrative ambition, while critics cautioned against overreach. The debate energized research and framed new field questions for subsequent seasons. In the middle of a rain-damp morning, a conservator found a folded scrap of textile inside a sealed amphora. Under microscopes, the weave revealed pigment traces and a tiny embroidery motif that matched designs on a painted column fragment. The textile, once thought impossible to survive, became a thread of direct connection, a tactile bridge between life and stone that humanized the archaeological record in an unexpected way. What would you place inside the amphora if you were leaving a message for the future? A recipe, a tale, a child's drawing? Objects can be time capsules if we choose to make them so, but often they are accidental testimonies, a jar left in haste, a charm forgotten under a bench. The past is full of incidental messages when we learn to read them with patience and humility. The seed does not offer a tidy ending. It offers layers. In the last months of directed excavation, the team stitched their knowledge together with humility and small triumphs, a refined chronology that narrowed the temple's major building phase to a generation, radiocarbon series, calibrated, a clearer map of harbor channels that explained trade flows, bathymetry/LiDAR synthesis, and a growing catalog of everyday objects that reframed public ritual as braided with domestic life. The ring sigil remained slippery, never a single meaning, always a family of practices, but its persistence across pots, altars, tokens, and children's playthings argued for civic belonging as much as cosmology. It was less a word than a refrain, identity repeated in stone and cord. No one could say the sigil stood only for God or only for guild. It held both, and the people who used it knew how to move comfortably between those uses. A final field season closed with ceremonies small and serious. The team invited elders and fishermen to walk the control and protect buoys with them, to place simple offerings on shore in the way the community wished, and to accompany the catalogued finds into a local display that emphasized process as much as discovery. The display's first panel read, in a language older than bureaucratic categories, "We cannot own the sea's memory. We can only be its stewards." That sentence sat beneath the ring sigil and above a child's clay token displayed in a plexiglass case. The juxtaposition felt right, a reminder that stewardship must attend both the grand and the intimate. Closure in archaeology is a particular kind of promise, not that mystery ends, but that the conversation continues in better shape. The team published its final seasonal report with datasets open for qualified researchers, and it negotiated with regional museums to return repatriated items into local contexts. They also created a long-term monitoring plan that folded fishers into heritage protection teams and funded local conservation training so that the work would not depend on outside expeditions alone. Conservation, the team realized, should not be an extractive relationship. It should be reparative and reciprocal. The scientific questions narrowed even as they multiplied. Geophysical models now suggested a likely combination of slow subsidence and episodic storm-driven erosion as the principal mechanisms of submergence. Geophysical modeling. Palynological sequences implied a gradual inland shift of agricultural zones that would have stressed coastal economies. Pollen analysis. Epigraphic links to inland administrative centers, archival correlation, tied the temple's fate to broader political currents. Violence left scars in bone and burned horizons, but it did not tell a single tale. The city's decline was a palimpsest, one season's flood overlaid trade disruptions, which overlaid social realignments and occasional acts of violence. To say it sank in one night, or slipped away in centuries would be to invite an argument that the evidence refused to settle. The human stories stayed with the team. The young conservator who had found his grandmother's motif in a textile wrote later that the work had repaired a thread of family memory. The elderly storyteller who had once said the sea kept a house for itself became a collaborator in the gallery's oral history corner. Visitors sat with her as she told of lamps and processions and the taste of salt on bread. Those moments, private rejoinders to academic publication, became the emotional scaffolding of the project. They reminded everyone that the past is not only an object to be dated but a voice to be heard. Ethics guided many of the difficult choices. When a lucrative but ethically fraught offer arrived to finance rapid extraction in exchange for media rights, the team refused. When looted fragments turned up on the market, legal and diplomatic efforts recovered some, but not all, bringing the team face to face with the reality that archaeology's antagonists are both human greed and structural inequality. Repatriation work, slow and often bitter, became a moral ledger the field could not ignore. The team published transparent reports of provenance and worked with policymakers to strengthen maritime heritage protections, a process that has to be iterative and public. Technology had been a steadfast ally, but it was not a panacea. Photogrammetry and LiDAR produced models that allowed distant scholars to walk the submerged streets, but models do not replace touch. They are archives of possibility. Biomolecular methods detected residues that suggested trade routes and dietary choices, but they could not tell us the jokes told at the hearth. Each technical advance opened new windows and produced new blind spots. A mature archaeology, The team learned balances the high-resolution lens with the lowly human question. And yet wonder persisted, not the sensational wonder that headlines hunger for, but a quieter, steadier astonishment, at the tiny thumbprint smoothed into calcite, at the child's whistle that still sang in conservator's notes, at the way painted pigments pulsed under ultraviolet light like buried stars. Those small things anchored the grand hypotheses. They were proofs of life more than monuments of power. Where the ring-sigil would live next was unpredictable. It became a motif in local pottery made by a contemporary artisan cooperative. It was echoed in a musician's album cover and reproduced in school notebooks where children traced circles with pencils. The sigil migrated into new economies and new meanings, as all symbols do when they leave the context of their original makers. That migration raised questions about appropriation and ownership that the community and the museum negotiated with patience, shared rights, credit to makers, and restrictions on commercial reproduction where culturally sensitive meanings were at play. The story did not end with a single reveal. Instead, it folded into civic life, scholarship, and the slow accretion of knowledge. Future students would bring sharper tools, different questions, and new ethical vocabularies. The team's datasets sat ready for revision, their open formats an invitation rather than a claim. The temple beneath the water had taught its investigators humility, about causality, about scale, and about the limits of assertion. If you ask now where identity resides, in carved stone, in tokens, in rituals carried inland, the answer is that identity lives in the act of repetition, the ring traced again and again, the lamp lit at season's turn, the child's game echoing ritual form. Identity is praxis, not a fixed label. It is what people do with marks until marks become language, until language becomes memory, until memory becomes responsibility. When the final camera left the wreck and the buoy's antenna blinked a goodbye, the sea resumed its patient economy. Waves rearranged sand a little by the hour, and marine life recolonized crevices cleared by human hands. The site would change. It always had. Human responsibility is not to freeze a place in time but to steward its stories and to make them accessible, honest, and shared. Perhaps the largest lesson is ethical and modest, to listen long enough that the past becomes less an object of conquest than a partner in an ongoing conversation, to treat rhythms of water and social life as co-authors rather than obstacles, to accept that some things will remain unknown and that the humility of not knowing is itself a form of wisdom. The enigma deepens in that space between knowledge and awe, and the work of archaeology, patient, cumulative, collaborative, is a practice of honoring both. If you stood now at the edge of the shore where the ring sigil first made itself visible to modern eyes, what would you leave there as a small story for those who come later? A stone with a tiny notch? A child's drawing? A list of names? The best answer may be a promise to keep asking, to keep protecting, to keep sharing what we learn honestly and with humility. The temple beneath the waves keeps its secrets and its invitations. It asks not to be owned but to be heard, interpreted, and stewarded. It returns fragments that insist on human lives, gestures, market days, lullabies, and it keeps others hidden, like a quiet person who does not tell everything on the first meeting. In the end, the story folds into something like a vow, to preserve context while widening access, to honor local voices while committing to rigorous science, to resist the easy narrative in favor of a longer, truer conversation. The ring sigil remains a loop, and we are those who trace its circle, curious and careful. The last photograph the team took shows the archway they first found, its keystone still nestled beneath a feathering of algae. Light from the ROV slants across it like a thin, deliberate hand. In that photo you can almost see the past breathing, a slow exhale that is not defeat but continuity. The stones keep their silent witness. The living keep their questions. If the sea taught the team anything, it was this: preservation is an act of love that asks for patience more than for fame. The ruins will endure only as long as communities, scholars, and policymakers hold to the quiet labor of stewardship. The rest is rumor and tide. 3 last lines, offered like small candles. The stones remember more than we name. The sea keeps its rhythms. We must learn to move with them. Curiosity that listens becomes a form of care.